My family turned their backs on me after my husband exposed my 3-year affair and cheating scandal. Amy, tell me honestly, when was the last time we made love? Amy stammered, "That's nonsense, Alan. We've had intimacy." "Yes, we've had intimacy," I agreed. "But making love? That's something entirely different. Betrayal, heartbreak, and a family torn apart." After my husband uncovered my 3-year affair, my world crumbled as my own family turned their backs on me. This is the story of consequences I never imagined, and the devastating fallout of choices I can never take back. My family turned their backs on me after my husband exposed my 3-year affair and cheating scandal. I woke up stretching in bed, feeling someone hug me from behind. Confused at first, I soon remembered where I was and smiled. I felt his body against mine and his arm around me, stroking me. We hugged until the alarm went off. My lover got up and went to the next room to get ready for work. We always booked adjoining rooms to avoid suspicion about our affair. I am Dan's reference. We worked together for over 2 years and became lovers. Our jobs require us to work closely and travel frequently, giving us plenty of opportunities to be together without suspicion. Yes, I'm married and my husband works from home. My marriage is a disaster. I dated my first boyfriend, Alan, in high school. One night, while my parents were away, I got pregnant. By the time we told our parents, it was too late to do anything but have the baby. My parents were furious and forced me to have a termination. His parents wanted us to keep the child and offered to take care of her until we finished school. Alan stayed with me throughout my pregnancy, defending me from bullies, and he was even temporarily suspended from classes. The birth was difficult, but he stayed with me the entire time. Our beautiful baby girl arrived 2 days after my 16th birthday. When we held Lauren, we knew we couldn't give her up. At first, my parents disowned me, so we moved in with Alan's parents. They helped raise Lauren while we finished high school. After graduation, we got jobs, married simply, and moved into a tiny house. Our university plans were postponed again when we had another daughter, Emma. Over the next decade, we worked hard and raised our children with the support of our parents. We both worked part-time, combining jobs and studies, managing to raise 2 wonderful daughters. Alan adored his girls, and they were very close. My relationship with them was more strained, with frequent arguments. At times, I resented them, subconsciously blaming them for derailing my plan since I was 15. After graduating, I became an assistant to Dan Johnson, the director of business development for a medical device company. I was 29, and he was 38. We quickly became a strong professional team, and I loved my job. Sales were rising, and management was pleased. I finally felt like I had a normal life. My job required frequent overnight travel, often with Dan, traveling around the country, meeting clients, negotiating deals, and interacting with senior executives. It was exciting. I had a fantastic experience, and I loved it. I was traveling about 3 weeks out of every 4, sometimes for 1 or 2 nights a week, and occasionally on weekends. While I enjoyed the work and travel, it meant being away from my husband and daughters. Alan had to take on most of the parenting duties. Dan and I spent a lot of time together and got to know each other well. Despite our age difference, he had married around the same time as me and had 3 young children. To keep Alan from worrying, I told him I mostly traveled alone or with another woman and that my boss was a bit of an idiot. In reality, I admired Dan and loved spending time with him. When we traveled, we often found cozy restaurants to dine in, enjoying wine and long conversations. About 6 months into my job, after landing a big sales order, we celebrated with a special dinner and expensive French champagne. As we sat there, feeling happy and a bit tipsy, Dan placed his hand on mine and said, "You know, Amy, I'm falling in love with you." My heart raced, and I was speechless. After a brief pause, he stood up and extended his hand to me. I hesitated, then took it, and he led me to his hotel room. In the morning, we made tender love. I felt unbelievably pleasant. Our flight home was in the morning, so we ordered breakfast to our room and lay undressed in bed. After eating, we made love again before leaving. On the way home, I felt guilty for cheating. I rationalized that, having never had the chance to be with other men when I was younger, I deserved this experience. I also thought it might teach my husband a lesson for neglecting me, as our bed life had suffered from the early years of our marriage. I realized I was so preoccupied with Dan that I forgot to call Emma on her 11th birthday. Dan smiled and squeezed my hand on the plane, and despite the guilt, I knew I was hooked. When I got home, guilt consumed me. Alan greeted me warmly, but I avoided his affection. That night, when he wanted to make love, I refused, claiming exhaustion. In truth, I was sore and drained from my time with Dan. It was the first time I had ever turned Alan down. The affair, which had begun 18 months ago, continued without pause. Over time, I learned to manage my guilt and perfected the art of deception. My thoughts revolved around Dan. When we could meet again, the thrill of our secret life together. Slowly, the guilt faded into the background, and lying became second nature. I was infatuated with Dan and often entertained the idea of leaving Alan for him. We joked about it after making love, but both of us knew it would be a monumental step with serious repercussions, especially for our children. As the company expanded, so did the frequency of our business trips. When no legitimate trips were scheduled, we invented them, booking nearby hotels under the guise of work. We even planned weekend getaways, using conferences at distant resorts as a convenient cover. We were meticulous about our alibis. At work, we kept our interactions strictly professional. We avoided being seen alone together and never shared lunch or left the office at the same time. Communication was limited to secret email accounts, entirely separate from the company's IT system. In our city, we avoided meeting altogether and only spoke in group settings, maintaining appearances at all times. I carefully managed my home life to keep Alan unsuspecting. I called him at specific times to check in, ensuring my tone remained calm and casual. I avoided giving him details about where I was staying, and he rarely asked. When Alan suggested I find a less demanding job, I dismissed the idea, citing the excellent pay. At work events that included partners, Dan and I coordinated seamlessly. I introduced Alan to Dan and his wife briefly, ensuring our conversations were polite but superficial. We mingled separately, never giving anyone reason to suspect the truth. Alan, always supportive of my career, admired my success, but was visibly frustrated with the mounting parenting responsibilities he shouldered alone. Our marriage began to deteriorate in subtle but undeniable ways. Alan and I grew distant, both physically and emotionally. The intimacy we once shared dwindled to the point where it felt like an afterthought. I knew Alan was struggling, but I rationalized my actions by blaming our busy lives and lack of connection. Looking back, I knew our marriage had been tested from the start. We became parents as teenagers and married at 18, facing incredible challenges together. Despite it all, we managed to graduate from university, me with a degree in IT and Alan with one in commerce. We worked tirelessly to build a stable life for our daughters, Lauren and Emma, and eventually achieve financial security. Alan had always been my partner in every sense, and I admired him for his dedication to our family. However, the stress of my demanding job and frequent travel strained our relationship. I left home early and returned late, often exhausted from long hours and overnight trips. My weekends were spent sleeping in, shopping, or catching up on work. Sundays, Alan would go to the gym or meet friends for breakfast while I stayed home, too tired to join him. Family vacations became outings Alan took with the girls alone, further widening the gap between us. The changes in my personality didn't go unnoticed. The loving wife and mother Alan once knew had become distant, self-absorbed, and quick to anger. Our intimacy dwindled, leaving Alan frustrated and unsure of what had gone wrong. Whenever he tried to address the issue, I dismissed his concerns, attributing my behavior to work stress or fatigue. He worried about the trajectory of our marriage, but didn't know how to fix it. The tension reached a tipping point at the staff Christmas party hosted by the CEO. Alan accompanied me and finally met Dan and his wife. The interaction was polite but brief. Alan found Dan friendly and composed, not at all the difficult boss I had described. Dan's wife was equally kind. Alan, expecting more warmth given my close working relationship with Dan, noted my nervous demeanor and rapid speech during the introduction. Though he trusted me, something about the encounter left him uneasy. That unease would linger and eventually lead to revelations neither of us could have anticipated. The following year, Alan was busy starting his own IT consulting company while also raising our girls with little help. He set aside most of his worries about me, but my behavior remained unchanged, frequent travel and increasing emotional distance. I became dismissive and condescending towards Alan, showing little affection or love. Our physical relationship dwindled to occasional encounters, devoid of passion or connection. It was clear our marriage was unraveling, lacking intimacy and closeness. At the end of the year, Alan attended my company's Christmas party again, and our interaction with Dan was as brief and professional as before. Yet, for the first time since we were teenagers, Alan had a fleeting doubt. Could I be hiding something? The thought of me having another man in my life was almost unbearable to him. We had faced so many challenges together. Could I really betray him? Alan dismissed the idea as unlikely, but began to observe me more closely, searching for any signs of infidelity. He found nothing incriminating, leaving him torn between relief and unease. Meanwhile, Alan focused on his daughters. Lauren, now 15, was blossoming into a confident young woman, and Emma, at 12, was on the cusp of adolescence. The three were incredibly close, spending weekends together at soccer matches, dining out, and enjoying simple pleasures like beach walks or movies. Alan noticed, however, that the girls rarely mentioned me in their conversations. It was clear I had become a distant figure in their lives. One Saturday morning, as Alan and Lauren watched Emma's soccer match, Emma introduced her new teammate, Sai. Sai was tall, athletic, and charismatic, with a radiant smile and striking dark hair. After scoring 2 goals in her first game, she had already made an impression. Emma asked if she could visit Sai's house, and when Sai called out to her mother for permission, Alan found himself face-to-face with Sophie, Sai's stunning and kind-hearted mother. Despite his initial awkwardness, Alan and Sophie had a pleasant chat, and Emma's visit was quickly arranged. That evening, Emma shared glowing impressions of Sophie, explaining that she had been a single mother since her husband's tragic death 3 years prior. Sophie had moved to the city recently for work and was raising Sai and her younger brother Tom on her own. The following weekend, Sophie joined Alan and Lauren on the sidelines during another match. This time, Alan was more composed, and their conversation flowed naturally. Sophie expressed relief that Sai had made friends so quickly and complimented Alan on Emma's manners. After the game, Emma invited Sai over for lunch, and Alan, encouraged by Sophie's warmth, extended the invitation to include her and Tom. Sophie hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but Lauren's enthusiasm and genuine insistence convinced her. Lunch turned into an enjoyable gathering, with the 4 girls engrossed in conversation for hours, while Tom bonded with Alan over computers and football. During the meal, Sophie casually asked the girls if their mother attended their soccer matches. Lauren's response surprised her. No, she never comes. She's only interested in work and herself. Dad is our mom too. He takes care of everything. Sophie gave Alan a look of curiosity and quiet admiration. From that day on, lunches after matches became a tradition. Sophie and Alan grew closer as they spent more time together with their children. Emma and Sai became inseparable, and Tom developed a strong connection with Alan, often joining him for bike rides or tinkering with computers. Lauren frequently sought Sophie's company, enjoying their shopping trips and coffee chats. Alan began to appreciate the companionship and warmth Sophie brought to his family's life. While he continued to observe my behavior from a distance, he realized his daughters were thriving, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of happiness amid the struggles of his unraveling marriage. My daughters never mentioned their mother to Sophie, and neither did I. Sophie and I grew close as friends, supporting each other as nearly single parents navigating similar challenges. After the football season, our children often spent time with friends or on their own, usually without my wife, leaving me free to connect with Sophie. We began to spend more time together, walking, sharing meals, and watching movies. I found myself looking forward to our meetings and realized I was falling in love with her. Despite my feelings, we never crossed the boundaries of friendship. One afternoon, as we were having coffee, I mentioned how much I appreciated her spending time with Lauren. You know, she never stops talking about you. Sophie this, Sophie that, I laughed. Sophie smiled warmly. Tom's the same about you. Alan this, Alan that. He really needs a male figure in his life, and I'm so grateful for how you've stepped in. She paused, her tone becoming more serious. Alan, forgive me for saying this, but it's clear that things aren't going well between you and your wife. I hesitated. We had always avoided discussing Amy, as if acknowledging the problem would make it too real. For a long moment, I stayed silent, but then the words spilled out. You're right, Sophie. If it weren't for the girls, I'd have left years ago. Things were good once, but now it feels like we're just existing under the same roof. I've tried talking to her, but it's like hitting a wall. Sophie reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Alan, I'm here. Anytime you need to talk, I'm here for you. Her compassion overwhelmed me, and I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in years. I hugged her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt comforted. Another year passed, and the annual Christmas party came around again. This time, my suspicions about Amy's behavior had grown stronger. At the party, her interactions with her boss seemed far too casual, and it made me uneasy. When Amy excused herself to go to the restroom, I noticed her boss heading upstairs a minute later. Feeling a pit in my stomach, I decided to follow. I checked the restroom, but didn't find Amy. Searching the house, I eventually heard voices coming from a partially open bedroom door. Amy's unmistakable voice said, "Merry Christmas, my dear." Another voice responded, "Merry Christmas, my love." Peering inside, I saw my wife locked in a passionate kiss with her boss. My heart sank. I quickly retreated, determined not to make a scene. I returned to the party and pretended nothing had happened, though fury and devastation churned inside me. Amy reappeared shortly after, flushed but composed, acting the part of a loving wife for the rest of the evening. Back home, I bided my time. While Amy slept, I hacked into her phone and laptop. What I discovered confirmed my worst fears. Hidden in her emails, photos, and videos was irrefutable proof of a 2-year affair with her boss. Their correspondence detailed their love, their escapades, and even their discussions about leaving their respective spouses. Though her boss seemed hesitant about taking such a drastic step, Amy had been all in. The betrayal was gut-wrenching. I installed monitoring software on her devices to track her activities and began planning my exit strategy. I consulted a divorce lawyer who explained the implications of a no-fault divorce in our state. Custody of my daughters would hinge on their preferences once they turned 14, giving me 6 months to prepare before Emma reached that age. My lawyer also helped me safeguard my business from potential losses during the divorce proceedings. I confided in Sophie about what I'd uncovered. Her response was immediate and emotional. She revealed that her late husband had been involved in an affair with his secretary at the time of his fatal car accident. Learning of his betrayal had compounded her grief and left deep scars. Tears streamed down her face as she shared her story, and I realized how much pain she carried beneath her calm exterior. When she regained her composure, she offered her unwavering support. Alan, you deserve better than this. Whatever you decide, know I'll be here for you. Her words were a lifeline. As I shared my plans to leave Amy, I felt a newfound sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I began to imagine a life free from lies and betrayal. A life where love, trust, and honesty could thrive again. To set my plans in motion, I convinced Amy that, since we were both earning well, we should sell our small house and rent a larger place. I suggested we could use the proceeds as a deposit for a new home. She readily agreed. The house sold quickly, and we rented a nearby property, with me listed as a tenant under a 6-month lease. Sharing a bed with Amy became unbearable, so I feigned a cold and used it as an excuse to move into a separate room. I never returned, and she never brought it up. I also told my father everything and had him establish a new IT company under his name, with me as the sole employee. I closed my old company and began operating exclusively through his. My plan was progressing smoothly until I encountered Lauren, who looked nervous and scared. Dad, it's hard to tell you, but Mom is having an affair with her boss. I was stunned. How do you know? After we moved, Emma and I went back to the old house one day. We saw Mom and her boss there, Lauren said hesitantly. That's strange, but it doesn't prove anything. They were intimate, Dad. On the living room floor, reeling from the shock, I managed to say, I've known about the affair for a while. Then why haven't you done anything about it? Lauren asked, her voice filled with frustration. Emma saw it too, I admitted. I called Emma into the room. She had been listening from nearby and walked in shyly. I hugged them both tightly. Can you two keep a big secret? They nodded eagerly. I'm going to divorce your mother soon. I'm waiting until Emma turns 14, so she can legally choose which parent to live with. With you, they exclaimed in unison. It won't be easy, but we have to make sure your mother doesn't find out. They smiled conspiratorially, excited to be in on the plan. I asked Sophie to talk to Lauren about her first boyfriend, hoping to guide her away from the mistakes her mother had made. Amy's frequent absences made it easier to manage the situation and strengthen our bond. The time Amy spent away became a blessing, and we spent more time with Sophie and her kids, often enjoying meals together or outings. One Friday afternoon, while Amy was supposedly at a conference but actually with her boss at a festival, Lauren surprised me. Dad, I'll be babysitting for Sophie tonight. Oh really? What's Sophie doing? She's having dinner at Brazier Paris. I felt a pang of jealousy. Who's she going with? You, Dad. It's time for you two to go on a proper date. I've already made the reservation. Call her now and invite her properly. What if she doesn't want to go on a date with me? We're just friends. I don't want to make things awkward. Lauren handed me my phone with a pointed look. Call her now, or I'll do it myself. Nervously, I called Sophie. To my surprise, she accepted immediately, as though she'd been waiting for this moment. That night, it took me 3 tries to find an outfit my girls approved of. As I was about to leave, Cy and Tom arrived at the house. Don't worry about coming home late, Dad, or at all, Lauren teased, handing me an overnight bag with a sly smile. When I arrived, Sophie met me at the door in a stunning little black cocktail dress and heels. She looked breathtaking. Well, say something, Alan, she said with a nervous laugh. I can't. I'm speechless. Do you like it? She asked, spinning around. Oh, Sophie, I more than like it. We had a fantastic dinner, laughing and sharing stories as though we had known each other forever. At the end of the evening, as we stood at her front door, I hesitated. I know the kids made me stay the night, but you don't have to feel obligated. She placed a finger on my lips, silencing me. I'm counting on you to stay, she said softly, leading me inside to her bedroom. At first, we were shy and unsure, but it didn't take long for us to relax and truly enjoy the moment together. It felt natural, and for the first time in years, I felt whole again. Seeing her undressed was breathtaking. By the end, I was completely exhausted. The next morning, we made sweet love again and then lay in bed for a long time, enjoying the afterglow and the feeling of our bodies intertwined. It felt so right for both of us. We heard footsteps, voices, and then a knock on the bedroom door. Lauren poked her head inside. Good morning, you two. It's almost 10, and we're tired of waiting. Breakfast will be ready in 20 minutes. I would ask if you had a pleasant evening, but your expressions say it all. She grinned, and we heard laughter as they walked away. I turned to Sophie, smiling. Our kids are wonderful. The breakfast they made was delicious, and it was great to eat together as a family. Later, I tried explaining to my girls what had happened between Sophie and me. Technically, I had cheated on their mother. Their reaction surprised me. They rolled their eyes and laughed. Dad, it's time for you to be happy again. You're not really married to Mom. She left you years ago, so you're all in on this, Lauren said. Emma added, you and Sophie are meant for each other. Everyone wins. C and Tom get a father, and we get a mother. What if Sophie doesn't think it's a good idea? I asked, doubtful. Dad, it's obvious how she feels about you. Do I need to say more? Lauren said, smirking. Their confidence amused me, but it also made me realize how much they supported this. A few days later, during dinner, I announced I was going house hunting that weekend. Sophie looked curious and asked what kind of house I had in mind. I want it near the beach with 2 stories, a big family room, a kid's escape room, a large backyard, and a pool. It should have at least 6 bedrooms in case the family grows. Most importantly, I need to make sure the woman I like also likes it. Looking directly at Sophie, I added, I want to know if she likes it too. Sophie stared at me for a moment before leaning in and kissing me passionately. The kids cheered, dancing around us, and I took that as a very enthusiastic yes. After weeks of searching, we finally found the perfect house and decided to buy it together, pooling resources from Sophie's late husband's money and the proceeds from my house sale. Everything was falling into place as Emma's 14th birthday and my planned confrontation with Amy drew closer. Amy announced she was going to a sales conference on the West Coast for 7 days. Later, I checked her emails and discovered the truth. She was heading to Bali with her boss to celebrate their 3rd anniversary. To maintain the facade, they had concocted a story about spending time with their families. Amy left a day before Dan, with plans to return a day earlier, hoping no one would suspect. Her plan, however, unraveled spectacularly. The night she arrived in Bali, Mount Agung erupted, spewing ash into the air and grounding all flights. Her lover, still at home, was unable to join her, and Amy was left stranded alone on their supposed romantic getaway. The irony was too much. I laughed until my sides hurt. Checking her messages daily became a source of amusement. Amy was furious, as if Dan was somehow responsible for the natural disaster. Occasionally, she called home, sticking to her cover story about attending a conference. I played along, asking about her hotel and the city she claimed to be in. Each time, I logged into her laptop remotely and watched her frantically search for plausible answers online. Meanwhile, life in our new home was wonderful. Sophie, the kids, and I were thriving as a family. I instructed my lawyer to file a legal separation request with the family court and submitted documents for temporary custody of my daughters, including their signed requests to live with me. As Amy's planned return date approached and flights remained canceled, I wondered how she would manage the situation. One evening, she called with another fabricated excuse. She was staying longer to follow up with conference contacts at her boss's request. I let her ramble, knowing her lies were about to crumble. The life I had rebuilt with Sophie and our children was more fulfilling than I ever imagined. Amy's web of deceit was unraveling, and her absence no longer cast a shadow over our joy. The irony of her predicament wasn't lost on me. It was a poetic twist of fate. I could tell she was very nervous. It was fortunate she avoided video calls because I wouldn't have been able to keep a straight face. I reassured Amy that everything at home was fine and told her I understood her situation. Another week passed, and she was still stranded in Bali. I monitored her desperate emails and messages with her lover. Her boss had informed the office that Amy had to extend her leave for family reasons. He even called me personally, apologizing for keeping her away from home, claiming it was a critical opportunity for the company. I had anticipated his call and played my part perfectly, responding like a supportive husband to an overworked wife. I assured him that everything was fine and that I completely understood. Then, feigning curiosity, I innocently asked about where Amy might be going. Caught off guard, he stammered out a few locations, clearly improvising. I had already seen his messages to Amy, instructing her on what to say if questioned. My goal was simple: to make her nervous and plant seeds of doubt that her secret might be unraveling. When Amy called, I continued to act oblivious but slipped in tricky questions about her supposed location. Her hesitant, awkward answers were almost too amusing. During one call, I casually remarked, "Hey Amy, have you heard about all those poor travelers stuck in Bali because of the volcano eruption?" The silence on the other end was palpable. After a long pause, she responded, "Oh yes, I saw a bit about it on the news." Feigning concern, I continued, "One of my colleagues, Paul Howard, is stuck there with his wife. Do you remember Paul? We met him a few months ago." Yes, I think so," she stammered. "Well, he's working remotely from the Grand Hyatt in Nusa Dua. Not a bad place to be stranded," I added. I heard her gasp softly. The Grand Hyatt was where she was staying. What she didn't know was that Paul wasn't even in Bali. It was all a bluff. Immediately after our call, she checked out of the hotel and moved to a cheap one on the other side of the island. It was clear she was praying not to get caught. Back at home, my daughters and Sophie's kids found the entire situation hilarious. They had all bonded into a single family, and Sophie's children now felt like my own. Finally, after nearly 3 weeks, the volcano stopped erupting and flights to and from Bali resumed. Amy called to say her work was done, and she'd be home by Friday afternoon. I was ready for her return. When she arrived at our now-empty rented house, I was waiting at the kitchen table with 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. She walked in, looking both tired and nervous. Her deep tan, unusual for someone on a business trip, only added to her unease. "Wow, you got a nice tan on your trip," I said, feigning curiosity. "Did you actually do any work?" She muttered something incoherent, blushing. "Sit down and have a glass of wine with me," I said, pouring myself a glass and taking a sip. "Alan, I'm exhausted. Can we talk later? I just want to shower and rest before dinner." "Sorry, Amy, but this can't wait," I replied firmly. "The girls are staying with friends tonight, so we won't be interrupted. Sit down, please." Her face paled as she reluctantly sat across from me. I poured her a glass of wine, took a deep breath, and began. "You know, Amy, things haven't been good between us for quite some time now. Don't you wonder why that is?" She looked terrified and barely managed to whisper, "No, I hate to tell you this, but there's no easy way to say it." I paused, pretending to gather my thoughts. "I've met someone else. I've fallen in love with her, and I want to be with her. That's why I've decided to leave you." Her expression shifted instantly from fear to fury. "How dare you?" she snapped. "After everything I've done for you. Who is she? I bet you're sleeping with her. You're disgusting, Alan." She ranted for a solid 5 minutes while I sat silently, maintaining my sad, apologetic expression. Her hypocrisy was astounding, but I let her vent, knowing this was only the beginning of her reckoning. "I could see that you're angry, and that's completely understandable. There's no point in continuing this discussion right now. I'll come back tomorrow around noon, so we can talk again. We have a lot to sort out." With that, I left and returned to my new home, ignoring the barrage of angry text messages and voicemails that followed. I didn't bother responding. At home, everyone was eager to know how things had gone. Even better than expected, I told them with a smile. We had pizza for dinner and watched a movie together. The girls turned off their phones to avoid any calls or messages from their mother. I made it clear, however, that they couldn't completely sever contact with her. Why didn't I confront Amy about her affair? Because I knew it would hurt her far more to handle things this way. That night, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief as Sophie and I lay together, making tender love. All the stress and worry I'd carried for years melted away. At that moment, Amy was nothing more than a distant memory. The next day, I arrived at our now-empty rented house, carrying a folder filled with papers. Amy, visibly upset, was waiting with her best friend Claire, who also happened to be her lawyer. I had never liked Claire. I'd seen old emails where she encouraged Amy to continue her affair when Amy had expressed guilt and considered ending it. We sat down at the table, and Claire immediately went on the offensive. She accused me of being a terrible husband, claimed Amy was a wonderful wife and mother, and insinuated that I had taken advantage of her hard work. She smugly warned that if I didn't beg Amy to take me back, Amy would ruin me in the divorce and ensure I'd never see my daughters again. I remained calm, maintaining a sad but slightly mocking expression. "Amy, I know this must hurt you, but honestly, I'm surprised you're so angry. It's been years since I felt like you really loved me. For the past 3 years, you've been physically and emotionally absent from our marriage." Claire interjected, but I silenced her with a raised hand. "Amy, tell me honestly, when was the last time we made love?" Amy stammered, "That's nonsense, Alan. We've had intimacy." "Yes, we've had intimacy," I agreed. "But making love? That's something entirely different. I can even tell you the exact moment things changed. It was 3 years ago, after that business trip where you forgot to call Emma on her 11th birthday. She was devastated. Do you remember that? Because 2 weeks ago, on Emma's 14th birthday, you forgot to call her again while you were on a conference. I couldn't help but think of it as an unfortunate anniversary for us." Amy's face betrayed her guilt. "Ever since that trip, things haven't been the same between us. We've drifted apart, and I always wondered why. For the past 6 months, we've slept in separate bedrooms, and it hasn't seemed to bother you. I can't even remember the last time we went on a vacation together or just spent quality time as a family. When you're home, you're not really with me or the girls. Amy and Claire looked increasingly uncomfortable as I spoke. Amy, I'm sorry, but I've made my decision. I'm moving on. For the sake of our daughters, I hope we can handle this divorce as simply and painlessly as possible. Reconciliation isn't an option. Who is she? Amy asked bitterly. Do I know her? Yes, I replied. You've met her daughter, Sai. She's Emma's best friend. I met Sophie, Sai's mom, at a football match last year. Over time, we became friends, and that friendship grew into love. Recently, we decided to move in together. Before either of them could respond, I placed a large folder on the table. I've prepared some documents for you. Tab A contains the legal separation agreement I filed with the court 2 weeks ago. Tab B is the divorce petition that requires your signature. Amy's face paled as she processed my words. The sooner you sign, the sooner we can move forward. Tab C outlines the proposed financial settlement. Tab D includes the lease agreement for this house, which expires in 3 weeks. If you wish to stay, you'll need to renew it in your name. Tab E contains the utility contracts, which I've scheduled for termination in 3 weeks unless you take them over. Tab F shows a bank statement. I've taken 60% of the funds from our joint accounts. All credit cards are now in your name, and you'll be responsible for them. Finally, Tab G includes a temporary court order for custody and child support. The girls have decided to live with me, so I have been granted custody. Child support payments will be deducted directly from your salary, and we can arrange visitation later in a way that works for everyone. Amy and Claire sat there, stunned. Claire finally erupted, her voice sharp and accusing. You've been planning this all along, haven't you? You won't get away with it. We'll take your company, your girls, and your money. I kept my tone calm. Yes, Claire, I've been planning this since Christmas. That evening gave me clarity. I realized our marriage was truly over, and it was time to move on. And yes, selling the house was part of the plan. I used the proceeds to purchase a new home with Sophie after filing for legal separation. Since it was bought after that, it's not considered marital property. Claire's face hardened as she tried to counter. You think you're so clever, Alan, but your daughters, Amy will win them back. You can't just take them away. I stayed composed. Actually, Claire, state law allows children over 14 to choose which parent they want to live with. They've made their choice, but Amy can work to rebuild that relationship. It's important for their well-being. However, she'll need to show up for them this time. Actions speak louder than words. Amy remained silent, clearly grappling with the reality of the situation. Finally, I spoke again. The girls wanted me to ask if you'd meet them for breakfast tomorrow at the cafe by the beach at 10. They don't want to come here, but I thought it was important for you to meet. Amy nodded reluctantly, and I left without another word. The next day, my daughters told me how breakfast unfolded. Amy spent the entire time berating me and demanding they move in with her. Eventually, they excused themselves to use the restroom and quietly left without returning. What I couldn't understand was why Amy seemed so desperate now. For years, she hadn't cared about me or our family. Perhaps I had been nothing more than a convenient caregiver for her children and a stable presence in her life while she indulged her affair. From Amy's perspective, the shock of Alan leaving her for another woman was devastating. She had never expected it. I thought he loved me, she reflected bitterly. Despite multiple attempts to reconcile, Alan had no interest in returning to the marriage. The only contact they shared now was during the girls' pickups and drop-offs. Even her daughters were openly hostile during their visits, making every interaction tense and unpleasant. Watching them happily run into Sophie's arms after visits, deliberately hugging their stepmother in front of her, was more than she could bear. Finally, she told them not to come unless they truly wanted to. Amy had always assumed her life would remain the same, a husband to manage the home and care for her while she pursued her affair for pleasure. Alan's decision to leave her, cutting her off from the life she had taken for granted, was an emotional blow she hadn't seen coming. It left her reeling, wondering how everything she once controlled had slipped so far from her grasp. As the months passed, I began to understand the depth of my mistakes. Alan had been right. I had been an absentee wife for 3 years. I had poured all my affection, emotional energy, and physical intimacy into Dan, leaving nothing for Alan. The real surprise was not that Alan left, but that he had stayed with me for so long. Financial struggles soon hit me hard. I couldn't afford both rent and child support, so I moved into a tiny, dilapidated apartment. My nights were lonely, spent watching TV and eating cheap takeout. Meanwhile, my ex-husband was thriving. Alan was happy with Sophie, a woman so kind and genuine, it was impossible to dislike her. Dan's behavior also changed after my divorce. He became distant, claiming family obligations kept him busy. Despite me being a free woman now, he avoided spending time with me and often sent me on business trips alone. When we did meet, there was no longer an emotional connection, just lackluster physical encounters. About 6 months after my marriage ended, Dan announced he was leaving the company for a new job in another city. Devastated, I told him to never contact me again. I was left to face my mistakes alone. I couldn't help but think of the Joni Mitchell lyric, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone." I had foolishly believed I could have it all. My family, my affair, my career. I was wrong. Looking at Alan, I saw the happiness he once had with me reflected in his new life with Sophie. I remembered the way he used to look at me when we were young parents struggling together. We had faced so many challenges side by side, and yet we had been happy. How did I let it all fall apart? My daughters were thriving too. They adored Sophie, seeing her as a real mother figure. To them, I was just a shadow from the past, someone they were obligated to visit. Their indifference to me was heartbreaking. One evening, in a moment of weakness, I cried in front of them, lamenting my situation. Lauren's response was brutally honest. "Well, Mom, you're the one who threw Dad away." Her words hit me like a blow. I tried to defend myself. I wasn't a perfect wife, but he left me for another woman. Lauren's reply was cold and cutting. "Mom, he left you because you had an affair with your boss for 3 years." The horror on my face betrayed the truth. Lauren saw it and knew. I was ashamed beyond words. Alan had known all along, but never confronted me. My life was a disaster. I had lost a good husband, alienated my daughters, and destroyed everything I once held dear. Despite everything, Alan encouraged the girls to stay in touch with me. Over time, through consistent effort, I began to rebuild a fragile relationship with them. Slowly, they started visiting me without being coerced. Occasionally, they even spent the night. One evening, as I dropped the girls off at their new home, I asked Alan if we could talk. He stepped out of the car with me. Standing in front of him, I finally admitted the truth. "Lauren told me you knew about Dan and me. Alan, I'm so sorry. You were a wonderful husband, and you didn't deserve what I did to you. I was selfish and ungrateful, and I got exactly what I deserved." Alan nodded silently, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you tell me you knew?" I pressed. "Maybe you could have stopped me before it was too late." He sighed. "By the time I found out, it was already too late to save our marriage." "When did you find out?" I asked hesitantly. "I caught you with him at the office Christmas party last year. You didn't see me, but I saw enough." After that, I started digging and uncovered everything. I blushed deeply, shame flooding over me. "Why didn't you confront me?" Alan's voice was steady but firm. "Because I wanted you to feel the consequences of your actions." I did some research and found out Dan wasn't exactly faithful to his wife. I figured if I let things play out, he'd eventually grow tired of you and move on to someone else. If I had exposed your affair, his wife might have divorced him, and you two might have ended up together. I wanted you to face the reality of what you'd done, not escape into another fantasy. Tears welled up in my eyes. "You must hate me." Alan shook his head. "No, Amy, I don't hate you. I was angry and hurt, but now, I just hope you learn from this." His words stayed with me long after he walked away. In that moment, I realized how much I had lost. Not just a husband, but a man who had once loved me deeply, despite my flaws. If you thought I left you for another woman, it would hurt more. Your strategy worked perfectly. You definitely got your revenge. Looking back, I'm sorry you got hurt so much. Well, a little sorry, to be honest. You don't have to apologize, I said. I would have left you if you'd done what I did. Looking back, I was seduced by the excitement and became dependent. In the early days, I tried to stop, but it was too late. I got so wrapped up in him and my desires that I forgot about you and the girls. Alan's voice softened. My anger is gone, Amy, and I truly forgive you. I approach life more philosophically now. After all, I wouldn't be with Sophie if you hadn't cheated on me. Yes, I understand, I replied, a sad smile forming on my lips. And that's partly what hurts the most. Our marriage was difficult from the start, Alan. He shook his head. I don't think you're a bad person, Amy. You made a big mistake, but he was a professional seducer. You never had the chance to grow up properly, to enjoy the normal things teenagers do, like dating and figuring out who you really want to be with. Your boss took advantage of that. You're probably right, I said quietly. But why did you tell the girls about him? It was too cruel. No wonder they hated me. Alan's eyebrows furrowed. I didn't tell them, Amy. They told me. What? They came home unexpectedly and found you two in the living room. Remember? Right after we moved out? At first, I couldn't recall. Then, with a jolt of horror, the memory returned. They saw everything. I whispered. Yes. Even Emma and Lauren gave me a pretty graphic description of the event. He said, I felt my body crumble as uncontrollable sobs overtook me. The guilt and shame I had buried came flooding back, and I couldn't stop crying. Alan stayed silent, then stepped closer and wrapped his arms around me, holding me tightly as I buried my face in his chest. I don't know how long I cried, but eventually I felt myself being lifted, carried inside, and laid on the sofa. Everyone, including Sophie, was so kind. Sophie insisted I stay until I calmed down and then invited me to stay for dinner. At the table, surrounded by Alan's new family, I watched him smile and laugh. He looked genuinely happy. My heart ached. I had really screwed up. Later, as I walked to my car, Alan put his hands on my shoulders. Amy, I don't want you to keep punishing yourself and being miserable. We had a rough start. We were too young to be parents and commit our lives to each other. When you think about it, the amazing thing is that our marriage lasted 14 years. That's an accomplishment we share. He paused, a soft smile on his face. Look on the bright side. Our two mistakes produced two wonderful daughters, and we raised them into beautiful, strong women. That's a legacy of our marriage that no one can take away. You're right, Alan, I said, tears forming again. Speaking of mistakes, I have to tell you something else, he said, his tone light. Sophie is pregnant. That's why we're getting married sooner than planned. You seem prone to making mistakes, I said with a bittersweet smile. You're a good man and a better husband than I deserved. I wish you all the happiness in the world. I hugged him, kissed him on the cheek, and walked away. My life is busy now, filled with rebuilding and reflecting. My only hope is to someday find someone as good as Alan. Though I know the chances are slim. Why did Alan forgive me so easily? He told me once, because hatred consumes you. It makes you cynical. And besides, seeing me happy with Sophie is punishment enough. I loved you once, Amy. That's why I chose to let go. Our connection lingered, unshaken by the chaos that unfolded. Yet, while Amy bore the consequences of her choices, my focus shifted to the man who had derailed our marriage, Dan. He wasn't just the orchestrator of my wife's betrayal. He was a predator who thrived on manipulation. Determined to hold him accountable, I crafted a plan. It started with a simple email, a replica of one Amy might have sent. Hidden within was a Trojan, granting me complete access to his computer. What I uncovered was more than just evidence of our personal misery. Dan had been siphoning funds from his previous employer and was repeating the scheme at his current job. His deception ran deeper than I imagined. I gathered every incriminating document, file, and transaction and sent it anonymously to both his employers and the authorities. The evidence was irrefutable. At trial, he admitted guilt and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Justice was served, but I wasn't done yet. His wife, steadfast throughout the trial, visited him regularly in prison with their children, at least at first. That changed after I met her. I presented her with irrefutable proof of Dan's numerous affairs, along with his hidden life. Enraged, she vowed to divorce him. ensuring he would lose not only his freedom, but also his family. For my final act, I decided to visit Dan in prison. When I introduced myself, the recognition took a moment to dawn on his face. Dan, remember me? I'm Amy's ex-husband. His scowl deepened. What the hell do you want? To deliver some messages, I said with a faint smile. First, from Amy. She wishes you well in your new home. It's cozy, isn't it? I must admit, I had a hand in arranging it for you. Dan's confusion turned to fury. I leaned in closer. You should invest in better encryption next time. It took me all of 15 minutes to uncover your entire web of lies. I couldn't resist sharing my findings with your employers and the police. As his anger boiled over, I calmly continued. Oh, and I met your wife. She wasn't thrilled to learn about your escapades. I showed her some interesting material. Let's just say it painted a vivid picture of your extracurricular activities. She's done with you, Dan. Completely. To drive the final nail into the coffin, I placed doctored photos of his wife and me on the table. The shock and disbelief on his face were priceless. She wanted me to let you know, I added, you'll never see her or your children again. And she's already working with my lawyer to finalize the divorce. Dan was speechless, his expression a mixture of rage and despair. I stood up, satisfied. Revenge, Dan, I said as I turned to leave, truly is a dish best served cold. Life is often a series of costly lessons learned through our mistakes. In this story, betrayal, pain, and revenge left lasting consequences. Yet, in the end, it is forgiveness and resilience that help us move forward. A meaningful conclusion where justice is served and valuable lessons are learned.